So on to the main science topic, Venus. Venus the comet, Venus the planet, Venus still being very comet-like in its activities. But here we go, we've got about a 600-year period, possibly even longer, from the time when Jupiter captured the initial seed asteroid clump of material that eventually built and built and built into what we see as the planet Venus today. That happening, if I don't like putting time dates on things, but let's just say that, I'm not going to put time dates on this because then people misquote me. But eventually, according to Velikovsky anyway, Venus finally settled into its orbit, or it actually encountered Earth, which was a far cry from it finally nestling into its current orbit, but it encountered Earth at approximately 3,700 years ago. In 1950, Velikovsky put the date at 3,650 years prior to that time, so add 50 years, actually 60 years. So we're dealing with about a 3,700 year ago time frame, and as I've said repeatedly, that was not the Nibiru Planet X event. That was the Venus event. So there's a lot of misconstruction of history based on that misconception that somehow Nibiru Planet X was here 3,600 years ago, and it simply was not the case. It was very clearly Venus. And we don't really have a good record of when Nibiru was here, so it's clearly Nibiru is not on a 3,600 year orbit. But at any rate, back to Venus. So let's start out, and by the way, I believe it's the very end appendix of the weather book, which has a long scenario, actually a paper that I wrote in the early 1980s, called From Exodus to Voyager 2, I believe that's the name of it, the Velikovsky connection. And that's paper which I wrote in probably 81, something like that. I then had a picture drawn, some artist work added, and that now resides in the appendix of the weather book with some additional comments in parentheses and annotated, but the original text from 1981 is there in the appendix of the weather book, my weather book. Principia Meteorologia, the Physics of Sun-Earth Weather, written for the general public. And so at any rate, I'll go into a bit more detail here, dealing with the capture of Venus and its development as a comet. Now, okay, initially what the ancients saw, and this is according to Velikovsky, and of course much ballyhooed by professional astronomers, but I'm anxious for one of these events to happen again, for a comet to be captured by Jupiter or Saturn or whatever, and to then explode into brightness. So imagine Jupiter orbiting the Sun, the largest planet in the solar system, on its orbit around the Sun, discharging the solar capacitor. It has its own electrical discharge continually going on between the Sun and the outer solar system. So it is very much a comet-like object in its own right. We don't see the big visible comet tail, but that electrical discharge is still very much there. As I've stated in my theoretical work, the orbits, the objects like Jupiter, Earth, Mars that are in near circular orbits, they do not discharge the solar capacitor as much as a comet that would be in an elliptical orbit. A very different set of characteristics, but basically the same process, discharging the solar capacitor. So here we have Jupiter moving merrily on its way around the solar system. And as happens probably almost every day, Jupiter captures an object. And the way that works, it's a two-body process. The Sun and Jupiter acting in concert, and it creates a capture scenario. Now, Jupiter just by itself, or the Sun just by itself, would not capture something. This is a property of celestial mechanics. I won't go into a lot of detail, but the process, to explain it a little, the process is used in reverse to send satellites and artificial satellites, man-made satellites, out into the farther reaches of the solar system by giving what they call a gravitational boost. That's the reverse process. So you go by a planet in the right direction, and it will fling your spacecraft, give it a gravitational boost, and accelerate it for free, basically. Well, nothing's quite for free. Jupiter gives up a little bit of its energy, but certainly not enough to ever measure or notice. But it takes that satellite and flips it out. If done properly, then you can direct that satellite, in the case of the Pioneers and the Voyagers, redirecting it out towards the next outer planet, Saturn. And then Saturn, you get another gravitational boost, which launches the craft out to the next planet out, etc. So, at any rate, that's the reverse process of capture. Capture is an energy loss process. So an object is coming in to the Sun on an elongated orbit, and when it loses energy, all of a sudden it drops into a lower orbit, a more shallow orbit, an orbit that is closer to the Sun. And so that's the very first thing that happens. But Jupiter is doing this all the time with little rocks and pebbles, something the size of a baseball. This is going on all the time, but only rarely does it pick up on something of significant size in the capture process. The second aspect of capture is that the object being captured can be in any orbital plane. It just so happened that Venus was flung into a orbital plane coincident with the Jupiter and Earth and all the other planets, which made it a ripe candidate for becoming a planet. It was also, probably luckily, moving in the same direction after the capture as all the other planets, what we call retrograde orbit. And so it was moving in its orbit in the same general rotational direction as Jupiter, as Mars, as Earth, and all the other planets. Something going in the other direction is, let's say, not good. And the reason it's not good is because eventually the encounter speeds are going to be much higher. You might get a direct collision, which would be disastrous at those kind of astronomical speeds. And it eventually probably would have tremendous disruption of one of the planets and be blown to smithereens itself. And of course, that's what some people think happened to create the asteroid belt. An object came in and crashed into a planet that existed back there at that time, and so that's a possibility. It's a good possibility, but once again, there's no absolute proof of that. There's no observational proof of that, but I know scientists who are working with, for example, the Vesta group of asteroids, the great big, they were actually minor planets or big asteroids. They can see that those asteroids that are kind of in a family out there came apart. They were part of a bigger system, a bigger planetary type object at one time. So we know those things have happened, things have collided, things have broken apart, and but back to Venus. Now, the rock or the chunk of material that came in to eventually create the planet Venus was bigger than most. So let's make an estimate. It was, let's just say, for example, it could have been about the third of the size of our moon. But it was already pretty big, probably, because here is what the ancients saw. And this is very clear from all the ancient writings. You can read Velikovsky's books. He's very clear on that. And by the way, don't read what people say about Velikovsky. If you want to know what Velikovsky said, read his books, Worlds in Collision, Ages in Chaos, and Earth in Upheaval. Read those books and you will see what he said. Don't read what some other person on the internet says about Velikovsky or uses his name as a draw or whatever. Read Velikovsky's books and you'll understand what he said. But he was very clear that the ancients saw Venus erupt into a large comet out of the region where Jupiter was. And so the common term was that Venus was born of Jupiter. And that was the old mythological statement, so to speak, that the planets had a genealogy, so to speak, that Venus was an offspring of Jupiter. And, of course, Velikovsky tried to make a scientific interpretation, saying that Venus popped out of Jupiter, which, of course, is not exactly what would happen. That would be an impossible scenario physically. And so, unfortunately, Velikovsky was not a scientist and made some scientific mistakes in trying to interpret his historical analysis of old texts. But at any rate, what really happened was that Venus was captured by Jupiter, dropped into a lower orbit in the plane of the planets, and became a big raging comet all at the same time. Now, this is Venus the comet. Remember that the ancients saw these things. They sat there in the night sky and watched the night sky continually. And so we're very tuned to what was going on in the sky, much more so than people today who sit inside and watch TV, and when it gets dark there are street lights. A lot of kids in the city today don't even know there's stars up there, or they might see the moon or something. But I know I've heard from a lot of people that, they go take a trip finally out into the country and they go, oh, look at all those stars. I never knew there were all those stars up there. And so the average person today is totally unaware of what's going on in the heavens. So at any rate, the ancients were very tuned, and what they saw was the comet brightening as just Jupiter in general. You can imagine, you see Jupiter up there. It's that big kind of white orangish dot in the sky. If you have binoculars, you can see the moons of Jupiter lined up, the 4 moons going around Jupiter in their orbits. You can actually very easily see that with a fairly good set of binoculars or a small telescope. But at any rate, so the ancients, being very tuned to the sky, all of a sudden see the Jupiter brightening. And they're going, what's this? And then all of a sudden, moving out away from it, here is this comet. So they name it Venus. That's ultimately the name that that comes to us from the Greeks, who were one of the races that survived the actual Venus event. Okay, so I'm spending a lot of time on the capture, because that is very important. Understanding the capture, understanding where Venus the comet, Venus being born of Jupiter, where that mythology comes from. Now, Venus starts to move away from Jupiter, gaining and developing its own charge on its nucleus through the discharge of the solar capacitor. And the ancients start seeing Jupiter and Venus exchanging lightning bolts across in the sky. So this is their first indication that, this is not exactly normal. Something very unusual is going on here. So now it's got their attention. Believe me, it has their attention, because something very big and unusual is going on up there in the sky.